behalf of the National Committee on U.S. and Chinese Relations, I would like to thank the State College of Florida for hosting this event. They've been our host for the last 3 or 4 years. The National Committee promotes the understanding and cooperation between the United States and Greater China in the belief that a sound and productive Sino-American relation will serve the vital interest of America and the world. The Chinatown Hall is an initiative of that National Committee, and it provides program throughout the United States. This year, the Town Hall program involves 75 venues in 73 cities, and 36 states are represented. Now I'd like to introduce you to Julie Jakeway. She's the Vice President of Business and Administrative Services at the State College of Florida. Julie.
Good evening. Welcome again to the Chinatown Hall. We're very happy to have you here. My job tonight is as you get ready to have these interesting discussions in the webinar, is to remind you that the State College of Florida is your partner, is your community partner in delivering events like this. Additionally, since we began in 1958 with 500 students, we have educated more than 45,000 local citizens. In 2014 alone, more than 10,000. We currently have some interesting demographics. About 36% of our students are age 20 or under, age 21 to 30, 30%, age 41 to 50, 15%. Our racial makeup includes 13.9% Hispanic and 8.9% African American. We are about 39% male and 60% female at this time. So that's a little bit of information about us. In the past year, more than half of our students, 52%, received Pell federal grant subsidies totaling about $44 million distributed, and that includes some scholarships and loan money as well. Our overall budget for 2015-16 is around $50 million, so we are a large contributing member of this community in terms of salaries that people take home with them. We have, as most of you know, bachelor's degrees as well as our 2-year traditional degrees. Those are in nursing, engineering technology management, health services administration, homeland security, technology management, international business and trade, early childhood education, and public safety administration. I told you we had a number of employees. We have about 450 in addition of regular full-time employees. We also have another 300 or so adjunct faculty who teach here part-time. And this year we have adopted a new strategic plan, and one of the most important things of that strategic plan is that we engage our community leaders in collaborative curriculum development that responds rapidly to workforce needs, and that we establish a role for ourselves for educational, cultural, and workforce development in the region. So that's a little bit about the college, and it's my pleasure now to introduce to you Charles W. Freeman III. Mr. Freeman is a member of the Board of Directors of the National Committee on United States-China Relations. He's a principal at Forbes Tate, LLC, a Washington, D.C.-based public affairs firm. Mr. Freeman received a J.D. from Boston University School of Law and a B.A. in Asian Studies with a concentration in economics from Tufts University. He studied Chinese economic policy making at Fudan University in Shanghai and Mandarin Chinese at the Taipei Language Institute. Mr. Freeman previously served as Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China Affairs. In his role as United States Chief China Trade Negotiator, Mr. Freeman helped to shape U.S. trade policy toward China, as well as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and Mongolia. He also oversaw U.S. efforts to integrate China into the World Trade Organization. Please welcome Charles Freeman.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, and it's great to be in in this community. I want to thank everybody for giving me the time and giving the National Committee the time on a Monday evening to talk about China. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to speak for as short as possible, which is impossible because I'd like to hear my own voice, but to make sure that this becomes more of an interactive session than something that is just me talking at you. But I want to start by saying that the proposition that we're in a political season, and if you listen to the various campaigns as they are coming out, the presidential campaigns, you're hearing a talk of a need for a more muscular approach to China, that the existing engagement policy that we've conducted for the past 40 some odd years has been a failure, and that China is not where we wanted it to be. We've got a strong authoritarian leader in Xi Jinping who's cracking down on human rights. You've got a China that is being forceful in pushing its version of international norms through the various multilateral banks and so forth. You've got a China that is increasingly aggressive, in quotes, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, much more interested in pushing for its interests outside of its traditional borders. So the idea is that clearly engagement has failed, and that we haven't got a China that we hoped for, and therefore we need to move to a more muscular policy. And you've heard this from most of the campaigns. And I want to challenge that, but I don't want to talk about the strategic dimensions of U.S. engagement with China unless there are questions about it. I want to talk about the commercial relationship, because traditionally, really since the late '80s, when the U.S.-China relationship really got going on its own without the concerns about the China card in the Cold War, when the U.S. and China actually had to have a direct bilateral relationship that had to stand on its own. We had our strategic challenges with China. We had our normative challenges with China. China has a very different political system, a very different set of strategic goals for itself and for the world. And it was the commercial relationship which was really the ballast in the relationship for much of that time, much of the last 30 years or so. The commercial relationship really kind of guided us through difficult waters and all the rest of it. But now we're facing a time where increasingly the commercial relationship is being questioned as a source of stability in the relationship, and increasingly the question is whether or not the commercial relationship, the economic relationship, is not in the U.S. interest. And I think this is a big problem for us, because clearly on the strategic side we're heading towards, if not rivalry, certainly competition. We don't seem to be coming closer together on normative issues. So if the commercial relationship is not going to be the thing that holds us together, we're going to have a serious challenge. If you sort of follow quotes if you look back and you read Greek history and you look at Thucydides, there's the notion of this Thucydides trap, where a rising power confronts a de facto power or the big power, and their conflict is inevitable. And people who have looked at the China-U.S. relationship have said, we're heading for the Thucydides trap. And particularly those that say engagement hasn't worked, we've got to operationalize the rivalry, are heading towards this kind of Thucydides trap where we're actually heading to conflict. So we need to kind of, if you believe that the point of engagement is avoiding cataclysm in the Pacific between the United States and China, you've got to look for sources of stability. And the things that people are talking about with respect to the commercial relationship should worry us a little bit. I want to raise a few of these myths. I call them. Some of them are myths, some of them are realities, but they're all serious issues. There's the notion that China is stealing U.S. jobs, that currency policy is damaging the United States economy and the United States competitive position, that China's ownership of U.S. debt in the amounts that China does own is a serious problem for the United States, that Chinese businesses are inherently unfair in competition with U.S. businesses, that China's theft of intellectual property rights from the United States presents a major competitive challenge to us, that China's engagement, either through official or unofficial channels, in cyber theft of U.S. technology and or hacking of U.S. Technology infrastructure is a serious challenge. Chinese investment itself poses a challenge. You'll hear a lot more about that in the presentation after this. And then finally, I think this very base fear that China is overtaking us, that the Chinese economy is racing far ahead of us, and we're going to be much less important as time goes on. In fact, I think there are recent polls that say that most Americans actually think that China's already passed the Chinese economy has already surpassed us. Let me take each of those in turn. And the first is this concept of China as taking our jobs. And you hear a lot about that in the campaigns. Certainly that fellow Donald Trump talks a lot about that. And I want to say that if you actually do the math and look at the numbers in terms of competition between the United States and China for jobs, the numbers pretty much suggest that there's almost no competition. That what China has done traditionally over the last 30 years, Chinese employment has not presented a competitive challenge to U.S. employment for a couple of reasons. First of all, the story of China's rise in terms of trade and in terms of production has been largely one of shifting production and shifting supply chains from other parts of Asia, primarily the Asian tigers, Japan and Korea, to China as kind of the final stop of production for Asian supply chains. And much of that shift didn't really involve competition with the United States. Much of that had already taken place by the 70s, the shift of production to Asia, of electronics and other things had already taken place. So really the migration from other parts of Asia to China in terms of that assembly role hasn't stolen many jobs at all from the United States, except on the margin. In fact, if you look at kind of the U.S. trade deficit with Asia writ large, it's largely stayed the same as a percentage of GDP, despite the rise of China. Our trade deficit bilateral trade deficit with China has risen, while trade deficits with Japan and Korea and others have actually come down a bit, at least relative to GDP. And part of the reason for that is the way that we actually count trade. When we import a good from China, we don't take into account a lot of where the value has come from. All we do is we count that good as being imported from China or from anywhere if that is where the final transformation of that good took place. So, which is pretty wonky, but the reality is that because of the way the global supply chain in goods trade works now, we've got huge amounts of value that are flowing across borders, including from the United States to Asia, and then coming back. And all we're counting is that last piece of assembly. China has one of the lowest value add percentages of the goods it exports in the world, which means that it's really just still a lot of what China's doing is just assembling a final series of goods and exporting them to the U.S. or to Europe or anything else. The other thing I'd say is that you hear a lot about, in the campaigns, a lot about loss of jobs to trade, including to China, and China is the primary boogeyman. But if you actually do the numbers and you look at things, most of job losses are in productivity gains in the United States and elsewhere. So that it's not that the jobs are going somewhere else; they're just going. That's the nature of creative destruction. That's the kind of capitalism that we live in that Bernie Sanders may not like, but that's what we have. Second, the idea of currency being a a major issue for U.S. competitiveness, that China's manipulation or intervention or whatever you want to call it in currency markets to reduce the value of the renminbi relative to other currencies creates major economic competitiveness challenges for the U.S. Again, that would be true if the U.S. was producing competing goods and services with China, but we're not. So by and large, the fact that China has kept its currency relatively low compared to the dollar has actually meant that it's been a net benefit to the U.S. because we've been able to buy goods that are undervalued relative to what they might be if China was not intervening. Now, if you're Mexico, you're Indonesia, you're competing, you're in economies that are competing directly with China for that same sort of production, China's currency policy is a huge problem. But for the United States, it has not been, except, again, marginally and to the extent that it skews global markets generally. The other thing about it is that when we first politically began complaining about China's currency valuation back in 2003 or so, the idea was that, and I think Senator Schumer at the time came out with this formula that the renminbi was 27.5% undervalued. So he proposed a 27.5% tariff on all Chinese goods to make up for that current reduction in currency value. Well, the renminbi has gone up about 35% relative to the dollar since 2003, but that hasn't stopped anybody from complaining that the currency values are still too low. On the debt, the amount of debt that China holds, is that a competitive challenge to the U.S.? I think the best way to look at this is if I owe you $1, I worry about it. If I owe you $3 trillion, you better be worried about it. And the fact of the matter is that China is much more vulnerable because of its levels of U.S. debt relative to us than it otherwise might be. And furthermore, that the percentage of foreign debt, including Chinese debt, is still relatively low compared to the amount of overall debt that's held by American citizens. So the idea that China is holding this huge percentage of debt is it's true, it's 16% or so, but relative to the amount of U.S. debt holdings of our own debt, it's relatively small. Unfair competition. And is China engaging in unfair competition with us? Certainly, if you are a U.S. company or any foreign company doing business in China, you are faced with efforts to force technology transfer. You're facing competition from groups that have subsidies. It's a rough and tumble world in terms of competition with China. But again, if you actually look at the amount of relative subsidies, relative preferences, relative protectionism that many American companies enjoy here at home, the challenges in China are not as extreme as they otherwise might be, although they are real. But I will say that China did not open up its market in order to enable foreign profiteering. China opened up its market to benefit its own economy and its own businesses, and therefore, the notion that they are attempting on occasion to skew competition to benefit domestic players shouldn't surprise anybody. In terms of, there are a couple of areas which are not myths, and I want to sort of highlight them. The first is the IPR challenge. If you have been going to China for years, as I'm sure many of you have, you've seen American movies on the street for 10 kwai, or you see software available, pirated software available. If you've produced something in China, chances are someone else has copied that and is doing it somewhere else. The IPR threat is a real challenge to American competitiveness, and I'd say largely because for political purposes to tell folks here at home that, listen, don't worry about free trade, creating dislocations for jobs, because free trade will open up other areas, and we're all going to the knowledge economy. Well, if the knowledge economy is being undercut by IPR theft, it's a real problem. In China, I've gone and talked to groups about the IPR theft, and invariably someone stands up and says, "Listen, you guys got to use gunpowder and paper and the printing press without giving us any royalties. Why should we be paying royalties for the use of Microsoft Windows?" I guess fair enough, but it points to this notion of intellectual property as a public good, and culturally moving China to begin to look at IPR as something useful for its own purposes has been a real effort. It's starting to change now, but still IPR theft is a real problem. Cyber hacking. We just, when President Xi was in Washington, we just avoided the Obama administration placing sanctions against Chinese companies for hacking, for cyber hacking, and the theft of intellectual property and technology through that means. So it means cyber is a real issue in the U.S.-China relationship, and you have the NSA saying that the amount of theft that has gone on by Chinese origin hackers of U.S. corporates is the biggest theft in human history. The problem with that rhetoric is that for a theft to really hurt folks, it actually has to be commercialized, and not that much of the property that's been stolen through hacking has actually been commercialized and put into solution in China or anywhere else. Some has, and we know where they are, and we've certainly seen efforts by Chinese corporates with government proxies to actually come in and try to figure out what deal terms were so that Chinese companies could come in and compete unfairly in terms of deals for resources and others. But by and large, the real harm has not been felt yet. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be fighting back. We should be. But the problem here is that the U.S. has this intellectual construct where we say there's a difference between spying for commercial purposes and spying for intelligence, strategic intelligence gathering purposes. So it's perfectly fine to hack into the Chinese premier's personal files if we want to gain some strategic advantage. It's not okay, for example, for us to hack into the Chinese National Overseas Oil Company and gain and look for their intellectual property. That's the theory. The problem is that the only country in the world that believes that is the United States. Everybody else has this view of security, national security, as encompassing both commercial security as well as kind of military and other strategic security. So it's hard for us to proclaim this dichotomy that China should not hack into companies to gain access to technology, when frankly we're really good at hacking into everything else. So there's an element of hypocrisy there. That doesn't mean it's not a serious issue. That doesn't mean that we don't need to deal with it, but there is an element of overblowing things there. Chinese investment, again, you'll hear a lot about this, but I don't know if you noticed, but when President Obama went up for the UN General Assembly, I guess last week or the week before, in New York, he didn't stay at the Waldorf Astoria where he traditionally stays, because that had been bought by a large Chinese company, the Anbang, and the notion was that that's no longer secure enough for the president. And so there is this notion that Chinese investment is somehow inherently suspect. And for those of you that know the company Huawei, which is a Chinese technology company that has, at least is rumored to have, ties to the People's Liberation Army, there's a huge amount of fear and suspicion that if we allow Huawei to take part in the U.S. telecommunications infrastructure, that's essentially sowing the seeds of our own destruction. And you can certainly you can certainly find reasons for concern, but put yourself in China's position. I mean, China is, Microsoft, Cisco, IBM, Oracle, all of the U.S. technology firms are deeply embedded in the Chinese information technology stack. They're ubiquitous. There's no way to disengage from them. So the notion that we're saying, oh, well, Chinese technology shouldn't be here, but all U.S. technology is fine, especially given what we know about backdoors into U.S. technology from Mr. Snowden and others. There's a little bit of hypocrisy there. Again, I'm not trying to be Pollyanna-ish or suggest that there are no reasons for concern, but to the extent that we're using these issues to drive a wedge between the United States and China in ways that allows people in the United States who want to operationalize our rivalry, I think it's deeply concerned. I know we're bumping up on time, so let me talk a little bit about the last issue about the direction of China's economy and will it surpass or has it surpassed the United States. The Chinese economic story has been remarkable. For the past, really since 1978, what we've seen is the wholesale redeployment of assets, whether it's people, land, capital, or other things, in ways that were from hugely inefficient production to now much more efficiency. So we've actually just because of productivity alone, China has just exploded to where it probably where it's likely to continue to grow. And I always remind people that for most of human history, China has had the largest GDP on the planet. For most of human history, China has had something like 35% of global GDP, except for the last couple hundred years. So it's not unforeseeable that China will get to that level of global GDP or percentage of GDP and surpass the United States. But China's economy is in a world of hurt right now. All that deployment of land, labor, capital, what they've done is they've effectively run out of gas. And if you think the four categories of GDP growth are land, labor, capital, and productivity or innovation, they've kind of run the course with everything except innovation. And they're having a very difficult time figuring out how to move to value-add production through the use of actually indigenous innovation. So if I'm looking at my hand, if I'm playing poker and I'm looking at the U.S. hand versus China's hand, I'm feeling pretty good. That's not to say that China won't overcome the challenges, and that's not to say that Xi Jinping and his team don't have a very solid plan to reform the economy to get them to where they need to go, but it ain't easy. It ain't easy at all.
Enjoyed your presentation very much. I've lived in Hong Kong most of my adult life and was actually involved in developing some of the export strategies for the Hong Kong Development Council that we put into China. I was at the post office today and I was sending out a letter, and on my return address it said Dr. Charles Stylen. And the guy taking the letter said, "What kind of doctor are you?" I said, "It's called international business." And he looked at me and he said, "Are you helping us?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to, but I helped the other guys for 30 years. And he said, "Oh, you're helping them screw us, aren't you?" Why is the message that you are delivering tonight, I think most of us probably buy into it. But with everybody else that I know, none of them are aware of what you've said tonight. One of my recommendations to one of the key Hong Kong players was that China should hire the best American PR firm. Because the message is not that message that you're delivering tonight. I mean, it bounces off all of us, and I think we understand it. But the other 99.9% of Americans believe the other side. Do the people that start these stories, do they believe do they actually believe in that stuff, or is this done for a political purpose only?
It's a really good question, and you weren't helping the other guys. Hong Kong is very much part of the same team on the econ front. I mean, it's all a win-win. I'll tell a story out of school from my time in government. I worked for the George W. Bush administration, and most of what I did, frankly, I negotiated with Chinese trade negotiators a lot, but a lot of what I did was go up to the Hill and talk to people in Congress about why the president's trade policy with China was not hurting the American economy. And at one point I said, enough is enough. I want let's get some data. And so I contracted with, or I didn't contract, but I negotiated with the U.S. International Trade Commission to do a pretty comprehensive study of the impact of trade policy with China on a number of key sectors that people were saying were under threat from trade with China. And so I negotiated this and I had this study ready to go, and I was ready to announce the study. And I ran it through the Office of Management and Budget process, which actually looks and makes sure that everything coming out of the Executive Office of the President has the political chops signed off on it. So I had this release that was ready to go out that said, okay, we're going to do this study. And about half hour later, I got a call from the White House, come over. Karl Rove wants to talk to you. So I go over to talk to Karl Rove without any realism. And Karl Rove wasn't there. But there was an army of about 20 different people there. And they said, what are you doing with this study? And I said, I'm trying to make sure that everybody knows that the president's trade policies are not costing American jobs. And he says, well, okay, if China isn't costing American jobs, what is? And I said, productivity. And they said, sorry, we like to have that bugaboo. So, I mean, it's a useful foil. It's a useful foil. And again, I'm telling that tale out of school, but I don't think that. I know there are some well-meaning people that genuinely believe this stuff, that trade with China, that all the stuff that we talked about tonight genuinely is harmful to America. But I think there is a surprising contingent that knows that it's all nonsense and yet continues to spout it. That was a long story, sorry.
Thank you for your most enlightening talk, Mr. Freeman. I'm a physician and inventor, and I have, in addition to winning a national award for my disruptive advanced wound care system, I also won a 10 million renminbi leading pioneer award from the China government.
恭喜恭喜.
Thank you. My loyalty very much is with the U.S., and I love this country. At the same time, I have great respect for China in that they have successfully engineered some of the greatest feats in human history, such as lifting nearly 300 million people out of poverty. I know how many decades ago we declared the war on poverty, and I think the number of prisoners taken have actually increased over the years. And so China has a lot of problems of its own, without any doubt. And intellectual property theft is something that I am very leery of.
Sure.
Yet I am, because of my involvement in this area, I'm acutely aware that the number of applicants, the number of applications for U.S. patent from China nationals, and this will surprise most people, is more than twice the number of applicants from Americans. Now, how could China be applying for twice as many patents at the U.S. Patent Office than the U.S.? Because the Chinese government has a program in place to subsidize their applications. So why would the China government spend, hundreds and hundreds of millions, and maybe even greater sum than that, to support their nationals to apply for U.S. patents, because they obviously recognize that intellectual property is a very important thing. And they are moving very much towards, I mean, there's a sea change of IPR laws and enforcement in China. And if they do not respect other people's IPR, why would others respect their IPR? And I think there's such a sea change beneath the surface that most people are not aware of. And since China's fate and the US fate is inextricably intertwined, the more we really understand what the true situation is, the greater the chance that we can realistically address the problems between the two nations and able to grow synergistically and maintain world peace. And that is so very important. So I appreciate the very important work that China Town Hall is doing in trying to get the truth out, because only by knowing the truth.
You got to join the committee, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No, I just a quick word on that. I mean, I finished up my thing talking about China's need to move up the value chain in terms of innovation as a matter of competitive demand. I mean, the economy really does need that innovation. So I think they certainly have seized upon intellectual property protection, particularly patents, as being the way to do that. You know, they're moving now from it. For a while, a lot of Chinese patent application was in design patents, which by and large we don't do. But I think now they're moving to genuinely innovative patents, and so there's some really great Chinese innovation. There really is. Not a lot of it done by SOEs, though.
I just wanted to mention this because I live in China most of the time. I just came back from 8 years of living there, setting up a string of English schools. But what I wanted to reinforce everybody is the people that are in line of taking over China are the guys that are 37, 38 years old. They went to school at Purdue, Northwestern University. Their language is bilingual. These are the guys that are stepping up to the plate in the next 10 or 15 years. So you're going to see some drastic changes, because I'm working with a group in Nanjing, and the gentleman here, his father runs Valparaiso University. He's tied in with Goldman Sachs and the Home Shopping Network. He's a patent lawyer from Thomas Jefferson Law School and went to school at Purdue. And he's coming up with inventions that he's doing and getting ready for marketing over here. And when I flew out of Shanghai in December, and the guys that were doing the security check, they spoke such perfect English, I thought they were from California, not from Shanghai. So things are changing in a drastically way, and I hear so much nonsense, and living over there, it kind of upsets you, because they have the Beijinger, they have City Week, and these are magazines specifically for the expats, and there's a ton of expats there, and they all intertwine with the local Chinese, and I've seen a lot of changes living there for the last 8 years. So I suggest everybody just take a trip there a little bit more often.
Good idea.
Hi, I'm a college student here at SCF, and yeah, thanks for inviting me. Do you guys do this at any other school? I mean, I don't want to...
Yeah, I mean, we do this, I think there's 73 different cities and 73 different schools that we're doing it right now. It's kind of a neat program, because you get the beam in from New York, where you've got the real experts, and then you have clowns like me that are fan out all over the country and do this. So we've got 75 people doing this right now all over the country.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, because
Yeah.
I have no idea what's going on right now.
Good evening. Thank you for your very cogent and rational presentation of the issues of the Chinese economy and the American economy. I'd like to get your perspectives on a kind of a strategic issue and linked to innovation, and that is in advanced materials. Mm-hmm. And these advanced materials, as you probably know, electro-optics, photo-optics, require rare earth elements. And I'd like to get your perspectives on what's happening strategically, or what you would suggest policymakers should do relative to rare earths.
It's a great question. I mean, for those of you that don't know the rare earth issue, the rare earths are that's sort of at the bottom of the periodic chart. There's about 8 or 10 different elements that are rare earths that are really important in everything from hard drives and photo optics and smart bombs. And there's an ongoing challenge because at right now, China produces something like 90+% of rare earths that are used in global processes. The reason that China produces so much is that mining for rare earths, producing rare earths, is awfully dirty. It's stuff that, if there was rare earth production going on, down the block, everybody would move or shut it down. And a lot of the rare earth production in places like California and elsewhere has been shut down for environmental reasons. As a result, China is producing much of the rare earths. It has a lion's share, but there are rare earths available in Canada and everywhere else. As a result of some clever lobbying, rare earth production is being reopened here in California and elsewhere, and in Canada, because of the concern that China has so much of global production that it could essentially keep that all for itself and eliminate the ability of anybody else to have smart bombs or hard drives. I worry a little bit about the rare earth, the rhetoric around rare earths, because and I actually did a paper about this 8 years ago on the rare earth issue and linking it into the politics. Because, as you probably know, a lot of the rare earths that are used in production of electronics and elsewhere, they're commodity products, and it's also not a stagnant market. That there's always synthetic materials that are coming up to replace those and are better than some of those. So I think that there's a little bit of hype to the issue. The other thing is that 90% of the products that are made with rare earths are actually produced finally in China. So there's a reason to produce where your customers are. So there's an element of that too. Again, we're starting to reproduce here, but I think it's largely been driven by DoD and others that are concerned about, making sure that we have access to an adequate supply of rare earths for a defense industry. And I know some people that are getting quite handsomely rich off that paranoia. So.
Good evening to those in eastern and central states. Good afternoon to those in mountain states on the West Coast and in Hawaii. I am Steve Orlins, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I am pleased to welcome audiences from 75 venues throughout the United States and 4 venues in China to our 9th annual China Town Hall, Local Connections, National Reflections. We created China Town Hall in the belief that U.S.-China relations are the defining relationship of the 21st century, and getting that relationship right is the key to peace and stability throughout the world. In past years, during the webcast portion of the program, I have interviewed President Carter, Secretary Albright, National Security Advisor Brzezinski, and other former government officials to kick off the town hall. This year, the webcast will focus on Chinese investment in the United States for 2 reasons. First and foremost, because this wave of Chinese investment is a new, critically important dynamic in the U.S.-China relationship. The second reason is something I learned 36 years ago when I was a young lawyer and I moved to Beijing to represent the first wave of foreign investors in China. Investment strengthens people-to-people relations like no other business activity. 13 days ago, at a dinner co-hosted by the National Committee, President Xi Jinping declared that we should conclude a balanced and high-quality bilateral investment treaty. He and President Obama agree this treaty would help create hundreds of thousands of jobs and bring the people of our two countries closer together. We have with us today 3 experts to discuss Chinese investment in the United States and the U.S.-China economic relationship at large. Before becoming America's 70th Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Rubin was co-chairman of Goldman Sachs. Today, he co-chairs the Council on Foreign Relations with the National Committee's chair, Carla Hills, and is a senior statesman of America and the world. During Sheldon Day's 19 years as mayor of Thomasville, Alabama, the city of Thomasville and surrounding rural area has seen over $700 million in capital investment and the creation of more than 1,000 new manufacturing and service sector jobs, many courtesy of the Golden Dragon copper tubing plant, which Mayor Day will discuss with us today. Dan Rosen is a founding partner of Rhodium Group and one of America's leading experts on U.S.-China relations. He's on the board of directors of the National Committee, and along with Thilo Heinemann, who he tells me is in Atlanta today, wrote New Neighbors, Chinese Investment in the United States. You have a summary of the study in your materials and can access the full report on our website at ncus.org/FDI. I'd like to thank our partners at all 79 venues and our small but very dedicated National Committee staff, which has done a magnificent job in coordinating this complex nationwide event. Let me also thank our local speakers, a veritable who's who of China experts in America. They have traveled throughout the country to talk with you today because they believe, as we do, that educating Americans about China will help fashion policies that are in the long-term interest of the United States. We also thank the Star Foundation for funding China Town Hall. We are now accepting questions submitted via Twitter using the hashtag CTH15. Let me now start with some questions of my own. My first question is for Bob Rubin. President Xi left New York a week ago, Bob, after his meetings with President Obama. Can you tell us the state of the U.S.-China economic relationship and how investment fits into the overall economic relationship?
Well, I can give you my view of it, Steve. I think, and I've thought for a long time, I thought back when I was at Treasury, which is now over 15 years ago, that the economic relationship between the United States and China was critically important to both of our countries, partly for bilateral reasons, trade and investment, but also for multilateral reasons. There are a whole host of economic, geopolitical, and other issues that are global in nature that no one country can deal with alone, but that can have huge impact on all nations. And I think in the world that we live in, where the international institutions themselves have become much less effective than they used to be, that the best hope for leadership is an effective relationship between China and the United States. And you can see the best evidence of that perhaps in the climate change agreements that have been reached recently. I think in terms of our relationship, Hank Paulson, who had been Secretary of Treasury under George Bush, and I wrote a piece for Atlantic Monthly in which we made the basic argument that many of the complaints we have against China with respect to their economic policies, China would benefit from addressing. And similarly, many of the complaints that China has against us with respect to economic policy, we would benefit from addressing. So in effect, we would each benefit from addressing the complaints that the other has about us. And I think if we did that, we would not only enact policies good for ourselves respectively, but also would take some of the tension out of our relationship. To go to the question of investment, Steve, I think foreign direct investment is a very important part, or can play a very important role in the point that you made about educating Americans about China, because there is a lot of wariness in both of our countries about each other. And I think that this question of education, of creating a much greater awareness in our country, but also in China, of the importance of this relationship to the two countries economically, geopolitically, and so forth, is very important. Let me just wind up by saying that foreign direct investment in this country brings in capital. We unfortunately have a very low savings rate, so bringing in capital should lower the cost of capital and provide needed capital for American investment. I think there ought to be ways to bring Chinese capital into infrastructure investment, though that really has not been a successful effort yet. It also gives us operations or businesses in the United States that have a particularly well-developed sense of how to export back to China. And so it brings with it an expertise that can be very valuable to us. And then, as you said a moment ago, I think it can improve the relationships between our two countries by giving each of us a better sense of each other through our economic relationship. There is the bilateral investment treaty, which I think Dan is going to talk about. And I think it's I'm a little bit disappointed that we didn't make some progress at that at the meeting between the two presidents, but I think that's the next major step that we need to take forward in terms of our relationship. Plus, I think we have to work on improving the trust in each country about each other.
Great. Dan, you're one of America's, or I would say you're America's leading expert on Chinese investment into the United States. Talk about how much there is, what your projections are for it going forward, and what do you think is the effect on the U.S.-China relationship of that investment?
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here and part of the town hall tonight. We have a 35-year-old relationship that was built on trade, on technology exchange between us, people-to-people exchange, and in terms of the benefits to China, American direct investment into China, which means companies going abroad and doing either greenfield operations, which means building something from scratch. That's generally what American firms did in China, or merger and acquisition, M&A, acquiring an existing factory. Those are what FDI means. That's what foreign direct investment is. Until very recently, there was no Chinese FDI really anywhere in the world. China was still at the stage where it was trying to keep as much capital as it could at home. So we look back to the year 2000, around the time that Bob and colleagues and myself, to some extent, were involved in getting China into the World Trade Organization. There was in that year about $68 million of Chinese direct investment in the United States. Smaller than the one factory that the mayor is going to talk to us about in a little while. Today, 2015 through the second quarter, $54 billion of Chinese investment in this country, more than 1,100 individual firms that have come over, taken the risks entailed with figuring out how to operate in a high rule of law economy such as ours, very different than where they're coming from. 1,600 separate establishments around the country. The study we did, New Neighbors Together, earlier this year, showed that 80% of all congressional districts are now hosting some amount of Chinese direct investment. Seems like a big number, 54 billion, but actually that's rather small when you consider the size of the Chinese economy and how much direct investment the United States hosts globally. We look forward just 5-6 years from now, one can easily imagine that number going to $100 to $200 billion of investment. And while the dollars are interesting enough, thinking about the jobs that are associated with them is even, I think, more exciting from a broader American perspective. 85,000 Americans today getting paychecks directly from Chinese invested companies here. And if the projections come out right, that number will go to 200 to 400,000 jobs. That's starting to be pretty significant numbers. In terms of the trends, we see some changes taking place even now, even though this is a relatively new phenomenon. In the early years, we had a couple big Chinese resource investments in America. Shale gas was of interest to Chinese companies. Today, it's overwhelmingly smaller, privately owned and controlled Chinese companies. We see them very active in lighter manufacturing, which is great because it's more labor intensive. Hotel operations, service sector, here to take advantage of American technological prowess and be part of this economy in a much broader way than we saw in the first couple years when this trend started to unfold. So it's starting to get pretty exciting in terms of the benefits from a national aggregate level and the job count, but very much so when you talk to local officials who see China's participation here as a new chapter in the American relationship. Not just the benefit of cheaper clothes and electronics as consumers, but Chinese firms coming over, being part of Main Street, and bringing a much broader set of benefits to the American experience.
We've heard from the macro from Bob, the kind of the mid-level from Dan. Now we turn to the grassroots with Mayor Day. Tell us how you brought this copper tubing factory to Alabama, how it came, and how the investment has changed your community.
Well, thank you, Steve. And first of all, I want to say I'm as a little small town mayor from a very small town in Alabama. I'm extremely proud to be here with you guys tonight and honored. Secretary Rubin and of course with Dan, I've gotten to know Dan through looking at this investment, and he actually called me about the Golden Dragon investment in our area. You know, as any small town would be in America, we want to try to bring new jobs to our area. One of the biggest challenges I had 19 years ago when I became mayor was we had 19 years. 19 years. I actually started my 20th year just last week. So, but the biggest challenge we had in our community at that time was we had a lot of exports, but the exports were our children leaving our community because of the lack of manufacturing jobs, lack of good jobs for our children, the lack of our ability to attract those good jobs. So we went to work to try to make our community better and worked very, very hard to attract new industry to our area, worked hard on infrastructure. We worked with our neighbors and other communities around us. But see, we're in that black belt of America. It starts up in the Carolinas and works its way all the way across to Texas. It's the cotton belt and the agricultural belt that goes all the way across the middle of Alabama, Tennessee, and all the way across Louisiana and Mississippi, all the way back up into the Carolinas. And it's where all the plantations were many, many years ago. But back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, we were the textile, where all the textiles came for cheap land and cheap labor. And up until about 20, 25 years ago, right about the time I took office, many of our folks, thousands of our folks, worked in textile factories across the Black Belt of Alabama. Unfortunately, right about the time I took office, that textile exodus from our area was in high gear, and now there are zero textile jobs for the most part in our region. Many communities tried to just wait it out, hoping, oh, those jobs will come back, those jobs will come back. We realized very shortly that we had to do something because there was no way those jobs were coming back. We had to basically look at ourselves and figure out what we needed to do. So we started recruiting lots of different industries and looking at what can we do best. We're in a railroad town, grew up as a railroad town, was actually named after a financier, railroad financier who came down, a carpetbagger, mind you, and he retired as vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank right here in New York. So how about that? But he had some real good friends called the Rockefellers and other folks. But we're that small town, railroad town that grew up, and we found out that we had a lot of great assets. Our folks were, our people were our best assets, and we could really do some great things. So we started working and getting the word out, evolving our community, making our community better. And we started working with a couple of projects that used EB-5 funding, which was EB-5 Development Centers, which is direct foreign investment into a U.S. development group. And we had a group that came to look at and vet those projects. And a gentleman from China, Ray Chang, came to our community one day It was actually on December the 3rd. I'll never forget it because it was on a day we had our Christmas parade. And to vet our community and look
What
at our
year?
community. I think it was back in 2009, maybe 2010. And so he came to look, and the project didn't go forward because it was still in that downward turn that we saw in 08, 09. But later he called me and said, hey, there's this company called Golden Dragon that's interested in coming to America, and they've asked me to kind of look at doing an RFP for them. And are you interested in attracting them to your area? And I said, absolutely. So we began working. I knew nothing about China as far as other than what I'd read, and I didn't know a lot about what was going on in China and what we could do to make our community attractive to the Chinese industry. So all we knew how to do was do it from our heart, people to people, as you said in your dialogue earlier. That's basically what we thought of, because we felt like we couldn't wow them. We're not Dallas, we're not New York, we're not LA, and we found out that most of our China friends look at the U.S. as LA, New York, Chicago, etc. So we felt like we had to do something special. But then we found out that, the best thing for us to do is just be ourselves, to be honest with our visitors when they came and learn how to be their friends and trust them and trust us. And as you said, Mr. Secretary, one of the biggest challenges we have in our country both countries, is too much rhetoric and not enough heart-to-heart talking with each other. We got to push politics aside and talk heart-to-heart. And that's what we did. We said, look, we're going to let you know we want you to be one of us. We want you to be part of our family in our community. So we invited them down. We went out with the RFP. We did a great job with that. And we came down to the top three. Came in at the top three. 62 different communities put out an RFP for this, responded to the RFP. And we came back in the top three. It was us, Dallas, Texas, and Conway, Arkansas, home of former President Clinton in the Arkansas area. And but we worked very hard to let them know that a small town, we worked very hard to help them understand that, it's cool to be rural. It's cool to be part of a rural community. Because, even in, we're not New York City, and to be honest with you, we don't want to be. We are who we are, and what we looked at is what can we help them understand about us that's different about New York, that's different about Dallas, that's different about other communities. And it was our ruralness. It was our genuineness. We had grandmothers that helped us make special dishes just for these guys when they came down. Homemade banana pudding became our secret weapon. And it's been written about through numerous articles. But it was the love that they felt when they came that really made the difference. And we feel like that one thing that we were able to look at them and tell them was this: if whatever the best strategy for your company is, that's what we want you to do. If to go to Dallas or to go to Conway is the best strategy, then that's where you ought to go. But if you want to do something special, come to a small town where we can grow with you and you can grow with us.
And what's been the effect? Obviously, you won. You're very persuasive. We all,
that's right.
The three of us and the audience around the United States agrees. So tell us the effect on the
effect.
I'm thinking of moving to Thomas.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to have you. But the effect has
we were
been
advocating him running for governor of Alabama. But okay.
The effect has been unbelievable, because now, just last week, the Washington Post was in our area. It was in Thomasville. And they interviewed a young lady that works at Golden Dragon. This lady for years had worked 2 and 3 part-time jobs just to survive with 0 benefits. Today she works for Golden Dragon in that manufacturing facility, makes enough money in one job so that she doesn't have to work an extra part-time job, has great benefits, and now one of the key things is because she was working 3 jobs before, she didn't have enough time to be with her children, to help their children with school. Now she has that opportunity. She works 1 full-time job, has great benefits, and is able to spend more time with her children. The impact to our community is a $100 million investment, 300 new jobs, could be as many as 500 in the future as total. The impact to a small town of 5,000 people in a region that's extensively rural, extensively poor. Our unemployment in our area is twice the national average. Some county just north of us, where Golden Dragon is, Wilcox County, is almost 3 times the national average. So the impact of this plant is unbelievable to us, and we're extremely excited and glad to be partners with our new Chinese friends, and we work with them every day so that they can be successful there, because if they're successful, we're successful. And as you stated earlier, Dan, now we have a Chinese product that was previously made in China that's now being made by Alabamians and produced here and shipped to U.S. companies. And that makes a tremendous difference in our community and our economy.
We have already dozens of questions from around the country. So let me start asking. The first one is off of Twitter, but it doesn't say where, from Liam. How has the Obama administration's pivot to Asia affected China's domestic and international policy? Has it antagonized the U.S.-China relationship? Dan?
You're looking at me, Steve. Well,
I could answer it too.
You know, I think the same phenomena we're seeing in the advent of Chinese direct investment in the United States is reflected in many other ways. China didn't do that 15 years ago because China wasn't ready to be global investor. Chinese companies weren't ready to leave home. They could barely speak, many of them, standard Mandarin, let alone figure out how to operate in a place like the U.S. So the same maturity and success of economic development that's brought China to Thomasville also brings China to Washington as a global competitor, peer competitor in many ways. So I think whether it was a pivot or whether it was any other policy phenomenon that was going to unfold during these years with China, you know, this is the era in which we're no longer dealing with a poor, developing, massive country, but a China that's up on its feet and is becoming globally present in ways that it was not previously. That's taking some getting used to for us. It's taken some time and effort for folks to get used to down south. And here in New York City, and let me tell you, it seems to me that it's just as difficult for China to get used to this global role as it is for us to get accustomed to it. So I'm not shocked and surprised at all by the kind of sense of tension that we see, not infrequently nowadays. It's part of China growing up.
Bob, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I think in a sentence, Steve, I'd say I have a fair bit of interaction with Chinese business people, economists, and political people, and I guess my instinct is to think that to the extent it's interpreted as an effort at containment, then it creates antagonism. I don't think it should be interpreted that way because that isn't its intent, nor is it something we should be trying to do. To the extent that it's interpreted as engagement, which can be mutually beneficial, then I think it can actually be, it can contribute to a better relationship. But so far, at least, my impression is that there's been a little more of a tendency to view it as troubling rather than as positive.
What about TPP today, where the president says one of the reasons that Congress should move forward is because this allows America rather than China to write the rules of trade and investment in the Pacific? How do you think that makes the Chinese feel?
Dan?
Well, good. So what we're talking about today, this morning, the United States and a large group of other Asian economies finished a 10-year negotiation to form a trans-Pacific partnership, a trade agreement among us that will reduce the trade barriers. China's not part of that negotiation. And indeed, starting a few months back, the president started pointing out and explaining to the Congress and the American people why this was in the American interest, is that if we're not out there doing what we've traditionally done, negotiating trade agreements, investment agreements, as we have done with China many, many times over the years, then others are going to get up and are going to do that instead. The U.S. has a more legalistic approach to our trade agreements. We like them to be enforceable. We like the firms that are party to them to be able to take it to court if they feel like the benefits they expected to have are not being provided. China traditionally has not cared for trade agreements that are enforced in that way. It's a lot less legalistic system. You don't go to court in China the way you do in the United States. So in a sense, the president's really just stating the obvious, isn't he? That the kind of trade agreements that have characterized the more advanced economies post-World War II are probably going to be the ones we want to be involved in. And China is still getting to that. The kind of rule of law that governs how business takes place in China is very different today than the way commerce works here. And I venture to say the Golden Dragon has probably come to have quite a bit of admiration for how easy it is to do business in Alabama once you figure out how law works.
This is from Chase from Denver, and this would be for Mayor Day. How is foreign direct investment from China changing ordinary citizens' perception of the U.S.-China relationship?
You know, it was difficult in the beginning. I won't sugarcoat it. Because when we first announced that a Chinese firm was coming to our community, it did raise some eyebrows but mainly because of the rhetoric. A lot of times that we hear the political rhetoric and the headlines we see on the nightly news. So we knew that we needed to have some get-togethers where people sat down with each other and kind of met. And so we would have actual, when we had a reception one night, we had this beautiful table of pure Southern food with the banana pudding and the fried chicken and all those things. But we also got with our local Chinese restaurant. And I think anybody who's been to China understands that the Chinese food that you get in the U.S. is different from what you get in China. And so we made sure that we had traditional Chinese dishes there as well so that we could help people understand that China, the connection in China, and help our Chinese friends understand that we wanted to go to the extra mile to make them feel welcome. They have acclimated themselves into our economy. They've acclimated themselves into our schools. They've acclimated themselves into, they really want to know more about the U.S. economy and learn more about us, learn more about our traditions. We provided guidance for them when their children would go to our schools. We would take them personally to the schools and make sure that their children were being accepted. Their children couldn't speak a word of English when they first came here, but in southwest Alabama, rural Alabama, 100 miles from any metro area, our teachers embraced teaching them English and working with them and tutoring with them. And within a year, some of these children were actually helping our teachers tutor in Mandarin and other things, so that we became a team. They became part of the team, part of our community, meshed very well in our community. And so we've actually seen a very positive, and more of our folks have wanted to learn more about the Chinese culture. Golden Dragon has actually brought cultural events into our community so people can learn more about the Chinese culture. But I can tell you, they are more hungry to understand more about the U.S. Culture than ever.
This is from Karen from Great Barrington, and probably best for Dan. What points are made by U.S. residents and local leaders who are opposed to Chinese investment, and how do you respond to them? Have any of their worries turned out to be justified?
That's a great question. And there are a number of issues that seem to come up again and again. At the local level, the one I hear most frequently is, isn't this Chinese investor somehow going to buy this U.S. facility, take it apart, put it on a boat, and ship it back to China? Or somehow otherwise transfer the activity of that firm back to the People's Republic? And Thilo Hanneman and I have looked at, as I said, 1,117 separate investments over the past 15 years. And there's barely a one of them we can find which was in any way acquired or built in order to move something back to China. The reason why Chinese companies are coming here is that there are assets here that are more profitable to be part of than trying to do these activities from back in the People's Republic. So that's the most common one. Much more common for an acquired American company to see an increase in employment levels after an investment than a decrease. I mean, businesses fail everywhere. Lord knows, unfortunately. And there are some firms that after an acquisition or a greenfield is done can't sustain the kind of employment that they had hoped. But the vast majority of cases are the opposite. So that's the one I would focus on.
Do you want to add?
I just want to make two comments, if I may, Steve.
Sure.
On the question of the president's comments this morning, I can understand why he's taking that position, because he's got to get this thing through Congress. Right. But I don't think China should view this as a negative from their perspective. In fact, I think that, as was true with the WTO was created, and then China joined it. It was very valuable to China. And hopefully what will happen here at some point, Steve, is that there'll be some sort of a parallel agreement, or in some other way, China will develop some set of trade agreements that are congruent with this. And it can be very helpful to China as well as to the United States and the other members. Secondly, I think what the mayor's done is remarkable. And I've talked to a number of governors, Mr. Mayor, about taking the leadership and reaching out to China to try to bring Chinese business here, because I think you're absolutely right. I think it could be tremendously valuable to our country. And I think local leaders, mayors and governors, are the best people to deal with the suspicion and the problems that you mentioned.
I mean, TPP should have open architecture, and it should allow the Chinese to join in the future with some deferred dates, the way NAFTA did and virtually every trade agreement we have.
I totally agree with that. But even if we can't accomplish that, at the very least, you could have a parallel agreement of some sort that was congruent with it, and that might therefore make China de facto part of it.
Steve, just to square that circle for just half a second, a China that is prepared to accede to something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership is exactly the China we want to see and have in the years ahead. China wouldn't really want to be part of this today because there are terms and conditions in there that Beijing's not ready yet to abide and to upload. But when it is ready, it will be ready to take on certain investment commitments for how we treat one another. We mentioned the bilateral investment treaty before, and it's precisely by hundreds and hundreds of now Chinese firms going ahead and moving abroad, doing as much as they can without the benefit of having those kind of agreements in place, that they're going home and bringing the learning of what it means to operate abroad that will make it possible for Beijing to step up to something like TPP in the years ahead.
It's perfectly acceptable for the United States to negotiate an agreement which says 10 years from now you need to have complied with this aspect, that it doesn't enter into force on the day that the agreement enters into force, as we did with Mexico and have done in many other trade agreements. Let me get to the next question, which is Xueying from Santa Barbara, California. Through FDI, how much influence will China have on American politics?
Mr. Mayor.
Well, locally, I can tell you, I think, if anything, they've had a positive impact on local politics because they have put their money where their mouth is. You know, in a small town, you know, in Washington and in state capitals around the country, a lot of rhetoric gets circled around the political spectrum and around political parties and focuses on the negative. But in a small town, we're just trying to work with each other to make things better. And when someone comes to Thomasville, Alabama and invests $100 million in our community, hires our people to work, Alabamians who are making this product that are going to U.S. manufacturers, other U.S. manufacturers, it's easy. They're not looking for influence, in my opinion. They're looking to be a partner with us. And that's what I found in my experience with the manufacturers that I'm dealing with and other future prospects that are looking in our area that are China projects as well. They're all looking to be a partner with us and work closely with us and be part of our American economy.
Dan.
You know, in New Neighbors, Steve, we reviewed some of the history of foreign direct investment in the United States. After the Revolutionary War, a lot of folks thought the British should never be allowed to invest in the U.S. They might take over our cannonball industry and we wouldn't be able to defend ourselves. Fast forward to the 1920s, after the First World War, there were folks who didn't think German chemical companies should be permitted to invest in the United States, that somehow in the event that we ever got into another dust-up, that would be a threat to us. It turned out not to be. It was a contribution to the American chemical industry and how globally competitive and cutting edge we were. in the 1970s. Arab oil money was being recycled back into direct investments in the United States. Once again, there were some who stepped up and said, we should block this. It's going to influence our politics in an unhealthy way. Somehow it'll undermine our interests. That was set aside, and we benefited from those dollars coming back to our shore. And then finally, Japanese investment, of course, still freshest in our minds in the 1980s, caused a lot of allergies to break out all over the country. Each time in 225 plus years of American history, we've decided that taking an open stance toward global investment, which after all is done by companies, not countries at the end of the day, was in the American interest. Do we have laws and rules to protect ourselves against foreign firms operating on our shores? Of course we do. Just as we have laws and rules and regulations, if they're not direct investors, that govern what they do here as well. So it's a bit of a red herring, I would say, to try to bring up worries about what it means that a Chinese copper tubing company is operating where it is in the U.S. If there were a record of problems associated with that sort of thing, it would be in the historical record. It's really not in the American experience.
I guess all I'd add is that, it's actually not, it's a sort of interesting question. I can see why people might feel that way. I totally agree with the comments that have been made. I guess I'd add one more thing, Steve. I don't think that our elected leaders are going to be influenced to do things that are adverse to our interests because of benefit to China. But if it does cause our elected leaders to understand China better, then that, I think, is a very big positive for us.
Foreign investment has become a little bit of a topic in this election. The discussion, I think, of the, what was it, A123 battery acquisition? What would you say about, and I don't think it's an exact, I would say, if Chinese investment in the United States creates a constituency for rationality in the discussion, it's a positive.
Certainly should be, right? I mean, and unfortunately, our political climate admits all possible kinds of dialogue, including some that's pretty negative and unhealthy. Absolutely. And indeed, we had a bankrupt American company, A123 Battery, that was acquired out of bankruptcy by a Chinese-invested firm called Wansheng Automotive, which has been operating here for 20 years. And instead of A123 being only in the history books like Hummer Automotive is, another company that almost got acquired by a Chinese firm, A123 has higher employment presently than it did even previously. So I'm not surprised that politicians are going to try to play the negative card on these things, some politicians. But they can't do it with a free pass anymore because there's numbers on the table now describing the amount of job creation taking place, the benefits in terms of tax base here, and then ultimately we might even see some investment in American infrastructure down the road, as Secretary Rubin mentioned earlier.
This is from Terrence Farrell, who's Commissioner of Chester County, Pennsylvania. And for Mayor Day, what role can county governments and other localities play in fostering business relations with China and attracting foreign direct investments for local projects? I've got lots of questions. We've only got 20 minutes, so let's keep answers brief.
First of all, be yourself. Know your community, because as you get ready to move forward and try to bring foreign direct investment into your community, you need to be able to talk very, very well about who you are, what you represent, where your heart is, because we can't be someone we're not. Okay, so if I tried to be one of you guys today, you'd see through me very, very quickly. So any company that comes into your community and wants to look at your community, or if you begin selling your community to someone else, if you try to be someone you're not, they're going to see it very, very quickly. So be who you are. Every community is different. Every community is genuine. Be who you are. Be ready for foreign direct investment and research. Find out who's looking at America. There are lots of websites out there that are looking at it. Participate and look at organizations just like this, the Committee on U.S.-China Relations. You've got all different types of other groups from all different places. You got the U.S.-Germany Partnership. There's all types of different things that you can look in and find out what companies and what investment is looking at the U.S. right now, and pick out a few of them that might match well with your community and begin learning about them and what they're looking for. But you got to educate yourselves on who they are, what will it take to land them in your community? Do I have the infrastructure that matches up? And can we bring that company or those folks to our community and be genuinely friendly to them? Because at the end of the day, any company that's looking at investing in the U.S., they're going to be married to a community. They're not necessarily married to the country. They're not necessarily married to a state. They're going to be married to a community. It's like a marriage. You can be married for the next 20 to 25 years. And if you're going to be married, you got to get to know each other and work very, very closely together with them through the good times and the bad to be successful.
Trevor from Atlanta asks, will China's slowdown cause a drop in outward investment?
In some sectors, it already has. China was the world's biggest investor in extractive industries, natural resources around the world. Therefore, Australia and Canada were hosting more Chinese direct investment than the United States, even though they're much smaller economies, until recently. They've borne the brunt of China's industrial slowdown. But at the same time, outbound investment by smaller private Chinese companies that already have huge market shares in the United States as original manufacturers of the things that wind up having somebody else's brands on them they're going to die if they don't figure out how to get closer to the consumer. And so it's a boom time, really, for a different class, a different breed of Chinese firms to come to our shores, try to find some way to become closer to the American consumer experience. And if they don't, they're not going to make it. So it's quite a complicated negotiation here. It's not just strong Chinese companies looking for buying opportunities abroad. It's Chinese firms that have done well for decades, but because of changes in China, as the questioner suggests, have an urgent need now to lengthen their production chain activity.
A related question from Eric from Assumption College. Given the forecasted decline in China's GDP growth, what can we expect in terms of valuation of the RMB, the Chinese yuan?
I spent an hour and a half this morning with 7 Chinese economists, and there were several American economists, 7 Chinese economists, and this was almost the entire subject of the conversation. And I think that probably the best answer to that is nobody knows. I think unless you want to really get into this, Steve, in great detail, I would say that nobody knows, but at least so far, the Chinese authorities have been quite committed to maintaining some stability in their currency, and they've intervened substantially and used substantial foreign reserves to do that. But they're going to have to face decisions as they go along, whether they want to continue to do that or move toward a market-based currency, which is what we've always advocated would, in our judgment, at least be best for them and best for the rest of the world. And I think there's no way to know what the outcome of that set of questions will be at any given moment in time.
You think some of your former colleagues are speculating one way or the other?
Oh, I think tons of my former colleagues are speculating in every which what way.
But no consensus move?
No, I would say there's no consensus.
From Kansas City, the International Relations Council of Kansas City, for Mayor Day, did you face initial pushback in your community from business or other community members who did not want foreign investment?
Yes. I went to church on Sunday morning after we announced this project and had several Korean War vets that cornered me up at the water fountain at church and said, I can't believe you're bringing a Chinese company. I fought against those guys in Korea. And, it's kind of like going back to what Dan said earlier, it's kind of like my grandfather, who was a World War II vet, said, I wouldn't buy one of those Toyotas if you gave it to me. I wouldn't have one of them. Or going back to Germany in World War I, all those things, it's a change in our culture. And sometimes changing in our culture is different. It's uncomfortable, but that, as we would say sometimes in the South, the boogeyman doesn't exist. And a lot of times we want to make the boogeyman China. We want to make the boogeyman some other entity. And really, the enemy at times, in my opinion, is us. We have tried to Americanize the whole world. We have to understand that we love America, I love my country, but at times they want to be like us. But we don't need to try to force it on them. But I have not had one group of individuals, companies, whether it's German or others, who have come to our community that want to come here and take over and do something according to their culture. They're coming to learn. Every time I've been to China, every time I've been anywhere, they want to know more about the U.S. economy, how to do business in the U.S. That is their number one goal. And when they come here, they want to Americanize themselves. So they've actually been received, once we've gotten over those initial impressions, they've actually been received very well. And many of my Chinese friends go to our local churches and other things and have acclimated themselves into the whole fabric of our community.
Bill from Austin, Texas asks, is Chinese direct investment in the United States leading to an increase in U.S. direct investment in China?
Well, that's a great question. And as a Longhorn, I appreciate the question in particular coming from Austin. It must is the answer, right? So for 30 years, it all went in one direction, the other direction. It was American investment into China. Chinese companies weren't ready to be here. Now we're in an era when it flows in both directions. And of course, coming from a very primitive starting point, the slope of that curve has been much higher in the direction of the United States. We've gotten to the point now where almost the same amount of commercial direct investment on both sides in the relationship. About 55 billion or so of Chinese in the U.S. and about 65 billion of U.S. and China, most likely. There needs to be a kind of symmetric growth. One, because it makes good economic and commercial sense. There's a logic to it continuing to grow in both directions. But then politically, as much as the U.S. doesn't require reciprocity on this, if other folks want to be silly enough not to let commercial investment into their countries, that's not actually grounds to say no here. It's not the way we work. However, politically, there's too much attention on China. It's too important. China needs to continue to do the hard work of opening its market wider to American investment, or it'll just sour what should be the best news in our bilateral economic relationship in decades.
From the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, is the EB-5 visa program necessary to encourage foreign direct investment in the U.S. from China? What changes do you think should be made to the program, if any? Anybody want to take that, or shall Mayor Day?
First of all, the EB-5 program, I think it came at a very critical time for the U.S. economy. It came at a time where the banking regulations were being, and all the regulations on U.S. investment had ratcheted down the economy in the U.S. so heavily that many riskier investments were not being taken up by the banks. And so, true entrepreneurs take risk. And there's been many of them, Ford Motor Company was an entrepreneur, Ford was an entrepreneur, Sam Walton was an entrepreneur. They leveraged everything they had to invest in the economy and into their companies. In fact, if you look around, no company ever grew up to be a big company. They all started small and became big companies. So the EB-5 program has been critical in a lot of companies in providing investment capital, especially in much smaller operations, not these big mega projects, but mainly smaller businesses and smaller companies that have come here. But EB-5 investors come from Canada, Australia, all over the world. Yes, there are a lot of Chinese investors that invest in EB-5. I think the EB-5 program can be improved. The biggest challenge of the EB-5 program right now is the lag time in getting these investors vetted and approved at the federal level. Please understand, every EB-5 investor goes through a very stringent approval process, Homeland Security, et cetera, before they can finalize this, and it takes a very long time to get it done. That's one thing that actually causes problems with the EB-5 investment program, is because of that lag time.
Here's an interest. Amy from Providence Day School in Charlotte, North Carolina asks, are U.S.-China economic ties strong enough to prevent a potential military conflict? Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, look, there are geopolitical tensions in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Certainly cybersecurity issues are becoming, or have become substantial, cyber appropriation of private intellectual capital and so forth. but if I don't think we're going to, I would certainly hope we never have military confrontation with China. But if we do, it will be because of factors and issues that are not going to be, I don't believe, offset by our economic relationship. But I think the probability of military conflict, it's a good question, but I think the probability of I think there are serious tensions, but I think the probability this will result in a military conflict, it seems to me, is very, very low.
You mean the South China Sea?
Well, any of them.
The question is, how much does the economic relationship inoculate the two countries against a military
I think what I was trying to suggest was, at least at its current level, Steve, I think that if the issues of the kind that we're talking about reach the level of tension that could cause military conflict, I at least don't think that the economic relationship at its current level or a likely projectable level would be sufficient to offset the power of that tension. If that tension develops the power that could result in conflict.
Just hard to imagine how the tension could increase to that level.
I think the probability of that is extremely low.
Right, yeah. University of Illinois. Illinois-based Caterpillar, a big partner with Chinese firms, saw its stock plummet with the devaluation of the yuan. What might be the long-term effects? I assume that means for Caterpillar.
God, you
Caterpillar, I know Caterpillar. I was fortunate to participate in the Paulson Institute's bilateral trade summit that they had back in the spring, and the CEO of Caterpillar was there. And I think one of the biggest issues there is China does, as you were saying, with all the metals and all the different things that they do, the mining and things that they do, they are a significant user of Caterpillar equipment. I think it's as much more the downturn in those types of operations and those types of metals industries, et cetera, around the world, not just in China, but many of the metals related, like with copper even, in South America and other places. You've seen what's happened in Brazil. You've seen what's happening in a lot of other places. The economies of the world, those when industries turn down, the downturn in industry, you're going to see the downturn in those commodities-based programs, mining, et cetera. And Caterpillar is a huge player in those types of industries, and it significantly hurt them. I'm sure the currency issue has also hurt them because they have significant presence in China. But at the same token, I think it's more to do with the downturn and those types of economies.
Right. Tim from Seattle, Washington asks, what are the global implications of the yuan becoming a reserve currency?
Well, I think it's I don't know if Dan would agree with this or not, but I think we're a long way off from the Chinese currency becoming a reserve currency. At least I think they would have to do away with capital controls. They'd have to have a market, at least this is my view, I'm not saying it's right, they'd have to have market interest rates. There'd have to be a confidence in Chinese markets. I think what's happened in the stock market and then with the currency in recent times has somewhat unsettled global financial authorities with respect to the way these kinds of issues are being handled in China. So I at least think we're a long way off from China becoming a reserve currency. On the other hand, it's going to be the largest economy in the world someday, and I would guess at some point they will, in my opinion, it may be many decades out, but I think their currency will stand alongside the dollar, or likely to stand alongside the United States, and we're likely to have two global reserve currencies.
In what kind of time frame?
You know, Steve, I have an instinct that we're talking, and you might have a better sense than I would. I think we're talking decades, not a decade.
I agree.
I would have just observed that the phenomenon of Chinese global direct investment, Chinese firms operating all over the planet, soon to pass about $1 trillion in global direct investment portfolio. That's the kind of national characteristic that comes along with having a currency which has some global role as well, right? Which unthinkable just even a decade ago. China was so much still at home, hadn't really globalized yet. Yes, China was manufacturing for the world, but that's really the easy part of globalization. The hard part is your firms not only having a motive to operate overseas, but figuring out how to do it, without making a mess of themselves at every turn. And Lord knows there are a few that have already. And the same forces that are bringing Chinese companies to the United States are giving rise to this question about what's the future of the Chinese currency, the renminbi. More and more trade is being denominated in renminbi every day. And there is now a logic to the renminbi, the Chinese currency, having a global role. Whether China is ready in the course of the next decade to do all the things that need to go along with it actually being a reserve currency, that's another matter for them to decide. There are some benefits of having a global currency. There are also some hard work to be done back in China if it's going to be conceivable for the renminbi to play that role.
Yeah, I guess I would add to that, though, Dan. It's up to them to decide what they want to do, but it's also up to the rest of the world to decide whether they're comfortable holding it as a reserve currency. But I think your other point's a good point. Even without becoming a reserve currency, it is becoming more of a factor in trade denomination and things of that matter.
Yep.
Dan, how does Chinese investment in the United States compare to other countries' investment in the United States? Where does it sit in terms of its percentage? How does it compare?
Well, we can talk about the level or with the stock, or we could talk about the flow. Now we're starting to sound like economists up here, right? In stock terms, which means if we add up all the investment over past decades, how does it compare? Tiny, really. $54 billion is nothing. That puts it way down the league tables. The British, very much the Japanese, the French, the Canadians, the Mexicans, even much smaller nations such as the Netherlands have direct investment stocks in America that are much larger than China's. After all, they've been investing here for, in some cases, hundreds of years. Those cannonball investments from back after the revolution I mentioned before. But then if we look at the flow, which is what's happening just this quarter or this year, China's moved up the rank tables very quickly. And China's total outbound flows, about 125 billion a year now, are starting to become in top 3 rank in terms of investment activity. So it depends on what you want to do with this story. If you want to say China's still at an early point, you can. If you want to say that China's impact on the amount of American direct investment here on an annual basis has now become quite important, you can tell that story as well.
Should we worry more about state-owned enterprise investment versus private investment? Does it matter?
To a great degree, no. After all, we have law in the United States to make sure that any company, whether it's state-owned or private, has to operate by exactly the same rules and laws and obligations once it gets here. It's not like we have two different sets of norms for one sector versus another. The Chinese still do. They're trying to change that for a good reason. It's not efficient to do so. So by and large, we don't need to worry about what a company's ownership looks like once we've decided it can invest in the United States. In terms of how we screen and evaluate whether there's any national security concern attached to a given investor, we do treat state-related firms as requiring a little bit more scrutiny than we do private. All of which is a little bit moot because 80% or more of the investment coming in from China today is by private Chinese companies.
I mostly agree with that, probably, Steve, but
We
not.
need to wrap up, yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Mostly agree.
Mostly
Okay.
agree, but not totally, because I do think you might have political considerations that enter into state-owned enterprise decisions that affect American companies, whereas in the private sector, you'd have only economic considerations.
I must apologize because I have not asked the most asked question, which was for Mayor Day, and it was, what is the banana pudding recipe? That has come in the most on our Twitter, on the CTH15, but we don't have time for the answer, unfortunately. You'll have to contact him. That's right, you'll have to contact him directly. But I want to thank all of the speakers at the 75 venues and the 4 in China for traveling to your venues and talking about the U.S.-China relationship. I want to thank our panelists. We kind of turn on the hose and it sprays questions in every area. Thank them for their answers and giving so generously of your time. And thank you all for joining us today.